Next up we have Dr Paul Goodison. He's a consultant at GDC Partners and Senior Advisor on the Ramphal Institute's agro-food sector programme. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. To help us understand a bit more about the EU dairy sector, but also its relationship or interest in Africa, can I just ask you to give us an idea about what's been happening in the EU and why Africa in particular is of growing interest?
2014 was a very interesting year for the European dairy sector. You had a situation where China, which had been the major growth market, imports began to slow down, and that affected everybody. It led, for example, to a 50% decline in skim milk powder prices and generally depressed international dairy markets. In August then we had a development which fell particularly heavily on the EU dairy sector, which was the Russian import embargo. In 2013 Russia had been the major export market for EU dairy products. Then of course the situation in the Ukraine, deteriorating relations in the Russian import market, closed that major market for the EU. At the same time, we had a situation where European dairy companies were preparing for the abolition of European milk production quotas after 30 years. And they were investing in lots of new capacity to provide bulk dairy commodities to international markets. So we had a situation where Europe was facing a decline in demand and expanding production at a time of very low world market prices. Fortunately, they'd been preparing the ground for these major changes in EU policy, the abolition of production quotas, and had started investing in Africa, which is seen as having enormous potential for growth in dairy consumption.
Okay, so you mentioned growing corporate interest in the African markets. So what is the nature of the EU-Africa trade and investment relationship within the dairy sector, but also how has it changed over the recent years?
Okay, we need to break that down into the trade relationship and the investment relationship. Basically, there's three areas of interest in the African market for European dairy companies. There's the traditional interest in exporting, for example, infant formula to West Africa, a very well-established trade. Secondly, there's that long-term potential of the African market, given growing urbanization, rising incomes, changing consumption patterns, which is likely to boost considerably consumption of dairy products in Africa. And then we've got this third area, what I refer to as Africa's role as a market of last resort. Whenever there's a crisis, like last year with the Russian import embargo, for EU exporters to establish markets, they generally tend to fall back on African markets. So what we saw with the Russian embargo was a lot of the milk that would have been going into what they call Putin cheese and Putin butter actually was redirected into the production of milk powder. And in 2014 alone we saw a 59% increase in European exports of skim milk powder. Phenomenal expansion, much greater than the European Commission had projected in December 2013. And there is a danger that with Africa's role as a market of last resort, whenever there's a crisis in Europe, a lot of this milk powder could find its way into Africa and displace local fresh milk production in the production of processed dairy products for urban consumers.
And so if you could explain a bit more about on the investment side, how things are going there.
Well, since 2013 there's been a lot of interest in Africa, and a lot of European dairy companies have been positioning themselves so that when production quotas are abolished they can find ready access to markets in Africa. So we have companies like the Danish company Arla, the French company Danone, the Dutch company Friesland Campina, all of whom have been expanding their investments in Africa, complementary to the domestic investments which have been made in Europe to expand production of milk powders.
And could you give us examples of some of these companies and the activities that they've been doing? I mean, you mentioned Danone, that's a very big household name, and I'd be quite interested to know what they've been doing.
The French company Danone is very interesting. They're well established in West Africa, mainly in Francophone Africa. And they've been looking at how they can expand out of that Francophone base into Anglophone West Africa, the big Nigerian market, for example. And so what they did in October 2013 is they bought West Africa's largest dairy processing company, which took imported milk powders and repackaged them and processed them to a limited extent. That was called Fan Milk International. And through this Fan Milk International, they're looking to reach out into Anglophone countries in West Africa. In East Africa, meanwhile, they've joined up with the largest Kenyan dairy company, Brookside Dairies, to use as a platform out into the whole of the East African market. In Southern Africa, Danone is well established. It's the largest dairy processing company in South Africa, and from that base is looking out to the region. So a company like Danone is actually straddling the whole African continent, and it's taking Africa very seriously as a future market for its dairy products.
And how about, you mentioned Arla as well and Friesland Campina, are they taking on a similar approach in Africa, or are they doing something different?
Well, Friesland Campina, the Dutch company, is actually a cooperative. So it's very concerned about what all the changes mean for its farmers.
Yeah.
It's interested in maximising the price for milk for its farmers. Yeah. Now, they were doing some very interesting stuff in West Africa from about 2010. They've been working with the Nigerian government to try and develop a local milk to dairy supply chains. Because as a farmer-owned cooperative, they've got an interest in farmers. And they committed to sourcing 10%, first 10% of their needs from local farmers, but within a longer term vision of up to 50% of the milk they use coming from local dairy farmers. Quite exciting. This would mean that African milk producers can benefit from this growing African demand for dairy products, with farmers getting weekly income from the milk they supply to these companies. However, like other competitive milk producers in Europe, the Dutch have to find outlets for their expanded production. And Friesland Campina, unfortunately, was very badly affected by the Russian embargo. So what we're seeing is new investments taking place in October 2014, which saw Friesland Campina buying a company in Côte d'Ivoire, basically to expand its outlets for milk powder into West Africa. So on the one hand, Friesland Campina is taking a very constructive approach to developing milk to dairy supply chains. On the other hand, the commercial pressures to find outlets for all that dried milk are intensifying. Now, a company like the Danish company Arla, they've realised that they're on a bit of a horns of a dilemma. They're also a cooperative. They want to see their farmers get a higher return for their milk. And they're looking for overseas markets. They want to triple their sales in Africa in the next 2 years. So they had started investing in self-contained dairy processing units with solar panels on the roof of basically what can be put on the back of a truck and moved around to basically meet the demand in Africa where it's expanding. It's a very flexible solution because investing in Africa can be quite tricky. But these units basically have no link to local milk production. They're simply there for processing and repackaging imported milk powders. They have them in Côte d'Ivoire, they're developing them in Ethiopia. And they've begun to realise this could leave African milk farmers out in the cold.
Exactly.
So what happened in January, they actually made a commitment to responsibly developing their trade and investment. Arla said it didn't want to undermine the incomes of African milk producers. and it's committed itself to independent auditing of its efforts to responsibly develop trade and investment relationships. So we have different approaches with different European dairy companies in different parts of the African market.
So against this background of EU-Africa kind of trade and investment engagement, and also the growing consumer demand within the continent, do you think, or what are the opportunities actually that are likely for African dairy producers? Are there any, and what are the most interesting?
Yeah, I think we need to make a distinction between African milk producers and African dairy companies. And the situation varies from region to region. If we take West Africa, there are dairy companies, but not that many milk producers. So 90% of all dairy products consumed in West Africa are either imported directly or produced from imported powders and butter oil and basic raw materials. That's the average for West Africa. In some countries like Senegal, it's only 50%, because you've had efforts by companies like Danone to develop local milk to dairy supply chains in association with local companies. You have also these efforts by Friesland Campino in Nigeria to develop local milk to dairy supply chains. Very ambitious efforts, but the way the world markets operate doesn't always help African governments make sure that African milk producers can benefit from growing dairy demand in Africa. What we saw in 2014 was a collapse in international dairy prices, because global production in Europe, the US, Australia, New Zealand had grown so rapidly in response to higher prices that when demand growth in China began to slow down, prices fell through the floor. This made it even more difficult to source fresh milk in Africa, because even before the price declined, it was cheaper to import raw materials and reconstitute dairy products than to source fresh milk locally. With prices falling 50%, it became much, much cheaper. You have to bear in mind that we're now getting more competition between companies in West Africa, so it's getting a very cutthroat and competitive environment in the dairy sector. So we could see a situation where efforts locally to develop milk production in West Africa are being undermined by this massive increase in milk powder exports. In last year alone, milk powder exports, skimmed milk powder exports from Europe increased 59%. And a lot of that found its way onto African markets. A lot in terms of local African demand, small in terms of the global scale of European exports. If we look in East and Southern Africa, we have much more firmly established milk to dairy supply chains, including with smallholder farmers participating. So in some respect, the threat to local milk producers is even greater, because that competitive imbalance between the costs of local milk production and getting that milk to the dairies, particularly from smallholder producers, and importing milk powders in bulk and reconstituting, the competitive pressures put local milk producers at a great disadvantage at the current time, given the low prices. So there's a lot of concern in in countries with established dairy sectors, that the current market situation could basically undermine milk production in Africa.
So after highlighting a number of very complex issues, not just the ending of the EU Milk Quota, but also the loss of the Russian market, the lowering of the global prices, which all affect kind of the relationship between EU and Africa in terms of how it deals with their dairy sector, or it interacts in the dairy sector. What I want to ask you now is quite a confronting question, which is basically considering the increase of EU milk production because of the ending of the quota, do you think this is a good or bad thing for Africa?
Well, it's a good and a bad thing for Africa. For Africa, let's break it down, shall we? I mean, African consumers, it means cheaper, safer dairy products.
Yeah.
particularly because European companies are beginning to invest in local repackaging and processing capacities as well. So it's good for African consumers. The investment which is taking place could also, in the longer term, be good for the African dairy sector as a whole, because it will raise standards and take the African dairy processing industry to a whole new level. The danger is that in the short term, the need of Europe to find markets for its expanded milk production could mean that a lot of these milk powders don't supplement African milk production to meet growing demand, but replace African milk production to meet growing demand. So we could end up with a situation where you have a dairy processing industry in Africa with not a cow in sight, almost entirely based on imported raw materials coming out of Europe because they're cheaper and they're safer. And a lot of these companies can't afford to have unsafe milk in their supply chain because the reputational damage would not be restricted to Africa. It would hit their whole range across the globe. So for these international companies, there's a danger in getting involved more in sourcing milk in Africa. But some of them are trying to step up to the plate. They recognize that if they want to have a sustainable relationship with the dairy sector in Africa, it can't just be on the basis of importing or exporting, European surpluses. It has to be about making sure that increasingly local milk suppliers meet local African demand for dairy products.
So I think overall during this conversation you've really highlighted the issue that Africa can be seen sometimes as the market of last resort, but also the idea that investment into Africa can actually be good in terms of consumers and in the long term, the African dairy sector. So thank you for highlighting those nuances. It's been very helpful, but I think there's a lot more discussion that can be done on this issue. And we thank Dr. Paul Goodison for joining us today, and see you next time on What's in It for Africa.